In this video, we're going to start with a piece of palette paper and we're going to finish with a complete painting. The palette paper comes from my DIY wet palette, and I wanted to capture the face that I saw in it. I used a graphite crown to outline the face, and then I sealed it in with matte medium. There is a little bit of risk that some of the paint will chip off, so you have to be gentle. And the graphite may smear just a tiny bit, but that's okay because we're going to be painting over it. Once the matte medium was dry, I began painting with acrylic paint. I'm using a combination of golden fluid acrylics and Liquitex fluid acrylics. Once the painting was complete, I wanted to preserve it. I was worried that the paint would flake off, and I thought the best way to do this was to apply a few thin layers of resin. After the first layer of resin on the top dried, I felt that the piece was still very flimsy. It was too flexible. After all, I'm working on a piece of brown baking paper. That's what I use on my DIY wet palette. I wanted to ensure that the piece stayed a little more structurally sound. So I thought that perhaps if I applied a layer of resin to the back, it would add that. Okay, so it's still a little more flexible than I want it to be. And I think that's because I've been using thin layers of resin. I kind of have to use thin layers because there's nothing to hold the resin from running off of this. So I think I'm going to add a few more layers and see how that works. If it doesn't, then I think I'm going to buy like a small tray or something like that, like a silicone tray mold, and see if that is something that will work to preserve this painting, because otherwise without the resin, I think the paint is just going to flake off the paper. So this hasn't been working the way that I wanted it to. I've put probably about 5 or 6 layers of resin on this, but it's not solid. You can see it still bends, and I'm afraid over time that is going to crack. I went ahead and got this mold. It's basically a tray, and I figure that someone could then frame it as if it's a canvas. It'll still have the effect that I want, but it would hopefully make it more solid. It'll save me time because each time I do a layer, I have to wait for the layer to dry, and that takes 2 to 5 days to cure. So this will be a one and done thing versus several weeks of me pouring layers and layers of resin over the top and not getting the effect that I want. Hopefully this is going to work out. I think it will. I think I'm also going to put like a little tag on the back with my name and what the title of the painting is. So let's see how this works. Just a few days to get it to cure. So I was going to pull it out of the molds, but I realized that right in here, this area, it's floated up a bit and part of the paper is sticking through. Overall, it looks good. I'm disappointed there's some bubbles. I must have been something when I was mixing. So I'll have to pay attention to that when I do my next one. This one is an experiment, so. Anyway, let's mix some more and I will fill the mold up. There's still room here for more resin. I'll go ahead and fill that in and let it cure for a couple more days. So this project was definitely an experiment and I learned a lot from it. I did make 3 mistakes. It's been about 3 or 4 years since I've worked with resin and I forgot a step. I forgot to use my heat gun. So essentially what I should have done was to put the project into the resin mold, pour the resin over it, use the heat gun, that will help dissipate some of the bubbles, and then let it cure. So that was mistake number 1. I didn't use my heat gun. The other mistake was in over mixing. I essentially mixed past the recommended time. I wanted to ensure that the resin was thoroughly mixed, and in over mixing I caused additional bubbles. So those 2 things caused a lot of the bubbling in the project. I'll just say he's effervescent, I suppose. The third issue is this. I think you can see it here. So the resin pooled more thickly up towards the top than it did down the bottom. It's thinner down here. There are 3 possible reasons for this to have happened. 2 of those reasons are not very plausible, but possible. One is that my apartment floor is slanted. Another is that my apartment building is tilted. Both are possible, but not as plausible as user error. And by that, I mean that the way that I placed the resin mold to dry, to cure, I did so where it was at a slight slant or an angle. Earlier in the video, you saw a blue background while I was pouring resin over the top. That is part of a large plastic tub that I use. I have a silicone mat inside it, that's the blue, and this allows me to have easy cleanup, and it also allows me to protect the resin piece while it's curing. I can put a lid over the top of the tub and place it on the shelf. It keeps dust from getting in. I live in a very dry, dusty region, so it's important for me to keep the dust out. It keeps cat hair from getting into it. I have multiple cats and I'm always battling cat hair. And it also keeps my cats from getting into the project and stepping in it, so it keeps my cat safe and it keeps the project safe. But in placing it on the shelf, I may have placed it in such a way that it was at a slight angle, and that caused one end of the resin piece to be thicker than the other. I'll have to pay attention to that a little bit better, make sure I use my heat gun, and make sure I don't overmix in future projects. And I will be doing more of these. I currently have 2 other pieces of palette paper drying and waiting for another video, another experiment. I'm going to also encase them in resin, and I'll be sharing those videos on the channel, so stay tuned for that.